In Valorant's history, there have been many weapons that have warped entire metas. Sometimes they become established parts of the game and don't change for a very long time. But in other cases, they were deemed so strong that they had to be nerfed, thus changing Valorant forever. So in this video, we're going to break down the most broken weapons in all of Valorant history. Now, the first one might not be the most powerful weapon on the list, but definitely one of the most frustrating weapons to ever exist. The Judge is still a hated weapon to this day, and even though this weapon is not bad by any means, it used to be crazy broken. If we look through the history of this weapon all the way from 1.06, this weapon has received giant nerfs many different times. Nerfed in 1.06, 1.07, 3.0, and 7.09, this weapon has consistently been hit with nerfs again and again, with no buffs to this weapon even all the way since the beginning in beta. To give you some perspective, for one, this weapon released at 1500 credits and now it's 1850, a 350 credit increase over the launch of the weapon. In addition to that, it actually had a spread penalty while in the air of only 0.5, now nerfed all the way to 2.25, which means that it is more than 4 times more spread than it had before while you were in the air. They've also reduced the damage, decreased the mag size from 7 to 5, and overall has made this weapon weaker and weaker as time has progressed. That being said, this weapon actually didn't hold a candle to how powerful this next weapon was, so strong that it demanded a hotfix, and that was the patch 4.0 Ares. Now, right off the bat, the Ares was a rather weak weapon back in beta, and in 0.5, they actually buffed this weapon, turning it from 1700 credits to 1600, making it more accurate, and overall, making it so that it didn't recoil as much with those first 8 bullets. And from there were a couple of minor buffs up until 4.0, where it received a very large buff, where they removed the spin up, and the firing rate increased from 10 to 13. Now, this really made it so the gun was incredibly lethal, and because it had no windup, it just instantly fired and you could delete people out of nowhere. And we saw clip after clip of pros dominating with this weapon that was only 1550 credits, an amazing eco weapon that was dominating even rifles in the right hand. It was a freaking nightmare to deal with and way too powerful. It got so bad to the point that some players were literally only using the Ares and still succeeding even at high EOs of play because you basically never ran out of money and you could force buy every single round with a weapon that was nearly as good and in some cases better than even rifles. Kind of crazy that this slipped through the cracks at Riot. Now, right afterwards, in patch 4.01, this was heavily nerfed, 1550 to 1600 credits, the pitch recoil was increased, the spread was increased, and now crouch benefits actually got decreased quite dramatically. So all this combined actually super nerfed this weapon out of the meta just like that, as fast as it was brought in, but for that little window, this gun was very freaking strong. Now, the next one is a little bit of a sleeper, but it's still important to mention, and that's the Shorty. Specifically, before 6.11, this weapon was incredibly strong. It actually did receive multiple nerfs back in 1.06 and 1.07, so even before that, this was even stronger. But notably, in 3.0, they actually reduced the price from 200 to 150, which was actually amazing for this gun. And that was super cheap to buy, so you can buy it as a secondary weapon. It was really good for one-and-done angles, and honestly, it was just strong overall. And in patch 6.11, they nerfed so many things about it, reducing the reserve ammo from 10 to 6, increasing the price to double at 300, making it so the damage was reduced at 0 to 7 and 7 to 15 ranges, and just making this weapon worse overall. And I think it just had a little bit too high of potential for how cheap it was, and when you could trade up for a rifle or anyone that just comes in your effective range, you got a little bit too much bang for your buck. And next up on the list is the classic pistol, a weapon that kind of did it all. And in 1.04, this weapon actually got some notable buffs and some notable nerfs. The walking and jumping spread got increased, but the running spread got decreased by a giant margin, and you got more accuracy while crouching or being stationary. From there, we entered a long period of the classic dominance, and Riot tried to nerf this thing many times to not really much avail. In patch 2.0, they nerfed the alternate fire. And then in patch 3.0, they further increased the walking inaccuracy and the running inaccuracy. And then finally, in 3.09, they nerfed the alternate fire once again in walking, running, and jumping. And then in 6.11, they nerfed the min spread on ropes. And even after all these, many today would still claim that the Classic is a very reliable and strong weapon. I mean, it's for the low price of free that has two types of fire and is fairly consistent overall. Well, the Classic has finally made it to a healthy spot. It's crazy that this weapon needed 4 sets of giant nerfs in order to put it back in line with what Riot wanted it to be. As we move on to number 4 on our list, this is where the weapons start to get crazy busted. And we got to talk about the Frenzy, which had one of the longest and most dominant reigns in a meta, especially in pro play, for quite some time. It's actually kind of funny because this weapon was really slept on and didn't get any changes all the way until patch 2.03, where it received a nerf going up from 400 credits to 500 credits. And you might be wondering, why did they change the credits? Well, the meta quickly became buying light armor and buying the Frenzy and running it down. It was an incredibly powerful strategy because you could literally tank a bullet to the head by a ghost and almost always kill the person after the fact. And if you were the secondary person, you could always get the trade. So for pro play, it was a very reliable way to clear people on site and trade out and then take site control, which gave you an advantage. And for people in ranked, you could do this on Reyna and run it down and get full shields and another Frenzy where you could kill another person and kind of just chain off in a way that was frankly very unfair. The Frenzy also seemingly took out a lot of the gun skill away from pistol round and made it more about a strategical push and pull of Frenzy battles, and I don't think that Riot thought this was the healthiest thing for the game. Now, this did persist for quite a while. Although it was in the game since the beginning, people didn't quite realize how powerful this was, but once they did, everyone started using it and it started to get adopted into the meta in a frenzy. Okay. And then Riot had to completely get rid of it, and then patch 2.03 happened and the gun combo with the armor could not exist anymore in that state because it was a little too expensive to buy with armor now. Now, the craziest thing is since then, they've actually done a ton of nerfs to this weapon. While yes, they did end up reducing the weapon to 450 credits, they reduced its accuracy while walking and running in 3.0, and then they actually reduced a ton about this weapon in 6.11. The min spread got increased, the spread on ropes got increased, the vertical recoil multiplier got increased while running, and even more changes happened to this weapon. So overall, it seemed that this weapon was much stronger than people gave it credit for, and it required a ton of nerfs to bring it in line with what was reasonable for the meta. Now, this next weapon had a ton of dominance in the meta at all ranks of play and in pro play for quite some time, and many will even argue even after all the crazy nerfs it received, it's still a very powerful weapon to this day, and it's the Stinger. Notably, this gun started to take over metas and really started to dominate. People were easily climbing all the way to the highest ranks of play with this gun and only this gun, and in a lot of cases, it was actually beating rifles from a mid to close range. For something so cheap, it was just way too powerful. And as of 2.03, they dramatically nerfed this gun. They made it more expensive at 1100 credits. They reduced the fire rate. They made it harder to control with the recoil, and they weakened the alternate fire quite dramatically. Now, even in spite of all those changes, the weapon still persisted to be very strong, and they made this weapon even weaker in some ways, but stronger in others, by making it so the running inaccuracy and the walking inaccuracy was now much larger, but they decreased the weapon's price total from 1100 to 950 as sort of compensation. However, they would have to go back on that compensation because in 4.07, they would actually nerf this weapon again, adding a firing input delay while bringing the weapon up to aim down the sights. But after a while of silence, they actually buffed this weapon again in 5.06. But even though they seem like small changes, just adjusting the alternate fire and the primary fire error, it seemed a little bit too much because in 6.02, there were giant nerfs to the weapon, making it back to 1100, making it so that there's new fall-off changes. And finally, they added icing on the cake with a nerf in 6.11, where now there is a worse min spread on ropes. And it's really crazy that this weapon was actually so powerful in the early stages and people didn't quite understand how to use it. The recoil was quite hard to control, and I believe as people got better and better at the game, they realized just what the economic benefit of buying this gun would be, because you could force buy every round, and if you set up the right engagements with the right characters, you could win even against rifles. And that is crazy that this weapon required so many nerfs to bring it in line. And it's also a little bit wild that at one point Riot buffed this gun and then proceeded to nerf it to worse than it was before they buffed it. Goes to show that some weapons might actually be secretly broken, but no one's quite figured it out yet. Now, the next weapon didn't have a lot of time in the sun, but when it was in the meta, it completely dominated pro level play, and as soon as player skill matched up to the level of this gun, it completely warped ranked play as well for quite some time. The operator was one of the most dominant weapons back before 1.09, and this was for a lot of reasons. The weapon had a decreased movement scope speed, so you could zoom in much quicker. It also had less of a dead zone, so while you were midway through the scope, you would become accurate far quicker. In addition to that, it had a faster fire rate. It also could be whipped out much quicker, and leg shots did 7 more damage. But none of that really mattered compared to the price at 4,500 credits compared to its nerfed 5,000 credits in patch 1.09. You also got to keep in mind that back then, there was no ISO. There were a lot less initiator characters, so simply clearing off an op angle was a lot more difficult than it is today. Add to that the fact that in 3 rounds, whether you won or lost all 3, you could buy an operator and typically even get abilities or armor on top of that because of how cheap this weapon was. And sometimes people would even win that first round, save the second round while their team bought, and then in that third round they would buy an operator. So you could win 2 rounds, get an operator on the third round where your opponents are rifling, and then just completely snowball from there because you're gonna outrange all these rifles, you're gonna get free picks, and the sniper was much more powerful with many less things to actually counteract it. You could see all of that together could make this weapon crazy more powerful, and this weapon needed a crazy amount of nerfs to keep it in line, but eventually did receive a tiny buff with it going down from 5,000 to 4,700 credits in patch 3.0, but all those other changes that made it weaker have stuck with the weapon since those big nerfs back in 1.09. Now, last but certainly not least, perhaps the most frustrating weapon to deal with for its time and incredibly broken, we got to talk about the Bucky. Now, the thing about this weapon is this weapon was incredibly busted at launch and people just didn't know. After a little while of dominance in 1.02, they did nerf its alternate fire, making it so it had less accuracy while you're running and less accuracy while you're crouching, but the walking accuracy they actually made a little bit more lenient. Then in 1.06, they actually increased the spread penalty by more than double, and in 1.07, they made it so that the headshot aim punch got dramatically decreased because when you got shot in the head, your character would literally whip back and it'd be really hard to shoot back if you got hit in the head at all with the Bucky fire, which was really easy to do in some regard. And then it also made it so that the tagging didn't slow people nearly as much from a distance, which was a frustrating aspect of the Bucky because people could hit you with the primary fire from really far away, slow you down, and then hit you with that alternate fire to just kill you out of nowhere with the convergence fire. But still though, this weapon was crazy strong, especially that alternate fire. If enemies were in the right range, you could literally just one-shot them, hold these certain angles, these one-and-done angles that enemies would walk in, and you would just get a free kill with this super cheap and efficient weapon. That's why in 2.06, this weapon did need some crazy specific nerfs. Now, it did get easier bullet spread on the primary fire and slightly better bullet spread on the alternate fire, but they dramatically reduced the pellets in a shot from 15 to 5, which made it so that you really couldn't one-shot people anymore with that alternate fire from full HP. In addition to that, they dramatically reduced the damage per pellet from 0 to 8 meters. It went from 22 to 20, and from 8 to 12 meters, it went from 17 to 13, and it really just made this weapon no longer able to do these one-and-done convergent fire angles that could one-shot people from 12 meters away, and was really freaking frustrating to deal with because this weapon was good from a lot of the angles in the game and was also good from close distance. Now today, after all these nerfs, the Bucky is in a reasonable state, but at one time, this weapon really was frustrating to play against. But everyone's gonna have their own opinion on what was the most dominant weapon in Valorant's history, so you let us know down below. What weapon on this list do you think is the most dominant? And if you enjoyed the content, do us a solid and smash that like and subscribe. Thank you so much for coming by. I really hope you enjoyed the video, and we'll see you next time.